I'm recording my homily for the 17th week of Ordinary Time, and we're continuing to go through the parables with Jesus in the Gospel. And today there's a couple very short parables, but I'm really only going to focus on one. And so it's the parable that Jesus tells where there's a man who's interested in buying a piece of property, and when he looks over the property, he discovers a treasure in the field. And so he goes and does anything he can so that he can purchase that treasure in that field, right? So it becomes singularly focused on that treasure in the field. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. But you notice as we go through these parables, there is an underlying theme in all of them. Well, there's a couple of themes. One of the themes is obviously he keeps speaking of the kingdom of heaven, and the kingdom of heaven is not like a physical place per se, but he's giving us a sense of what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And it's something that's created by God, and we are never masters of it. We are always going to be servants of it or participants. We're going to be part of this family. We're going to be his sons and daughters, but we're never going to be masters of it per se. The other theme of this kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God parables is the fact that he keeps saying over and over and over that we need to listen, because oftentimes we may hear, that's a train, we may hear that which God has for us, which I can hear the train right now, but we may not listen. We may not listen completely. And so he keeps harping on this because one of his frustrations, as you notice in the scriptures, is he gets very frustrated with the scribes, the Pharisees, the leaders who should be able to, I should say, their job is to be able to identify the Messiah and then point the Messiah out to the people. So in other words, they're listening, their ears to the ground, they're watching for the Messiah, they're watching for God's action in the world, but they're not. And they claim to be, and so that's where he says, yeah, they're kind of hearing, but they're not listening, they're not understanding, they're not getting it. And so he uses parables to bring it down to a very simple level, but it's only simple if people want to hear it, if people want to listen. For the people who don't, for the people who just want to take God's word and manipulate it for their own political agenda, their own agenda, whatever it may be, it's complicated, it's impossible, they'll never get it. And so the first thing is they have to have a desire for that which God is giving. Sounds like treasure, doesn't it? Okay. Now, the other thing with parables is that if we just read them on the surface, if we don't try to go deeper, mentally, spiritually, all these levels, if we don't try to allow God deep in within ourselves and our own life, we'll never get it. And so we have to always desire to go deeper. And when we don't, and we just look at the surface of the parable, we'll often misunderstand it and then misapply it to our life. And I went through that last week, so if you want to hear me give an example, last week's homily I did that. Let's go into the parable of the treasure in the field. Now, think for yourself, let's just apply this to our own lives. Let's say you want to buy a piece of property, okay? And let's say it's a couple acres, so it's a big piece of property, and you go to the owner, and the owner's saying, okay, the price is $50,000. You say, okay, great. And he says, go ahead, look it over, look at all the things on the property, and then tell me if you want to buy it. So you start poking around, and you start going down into areas, and there's some areas where you could tell people have not been there in a long time. And then you discover this box way back in the property. And you open up the box, just out of curiosity, and you realize there's $10 million in that box, okay? Now, as a good Christian, what do? You get a shovel and you rebury it, right? And then you go back to the owner and you say, hey, I'll give you $50,000, no problem. No, it doesn't sound very Christian, does it? It sounds devious, it sounds manipulative. And so the surface of this parable, the surface meaning of this parable is, I mean, what is it? Is it to be crafty? Is it to be kind of like, somebody who's trying to get away with something? who doesn't care about their neighbor, who doesn't care about the other, but just cares about themselves. That's obviously not the message of this parable. Now, a good Christian would do what? A good Christian would go and say to the owner, hey, guess what? You've got something on that property, and I need to show you. Now, once you do that, is that owner going to sell that property to you with that money on it? No, of course not, right? So, what is the meaning of this parable? Because it seems to be about maybe greed or selfishness or who knows what. So let's go deeper with it. And the focus is on the treasure, right? It's on the treasure. When we speak of treasure, we almost intuitively begin to think of that which we desire most. You say, what do you desire most? Well, that's kind of like your treasure. What do you work for in life? Why do you go to work every day? Why do you go to school? Why do you have the friends that you have? In some ways, they'll all point to what your treasure is. So what is our treasure? A couple years ago, obviously most everybody is familiar because Hollywood is the greatest evangelist in the world, at least according to their message. You can't go anywhere in the world without running into Hollywood. I mean, because every country, no matter where you go, they're going to have Hollywood movies, they're going to have their music, they're going to have the TV shows. I mean, it is everywhere. When I spent a summer in Mexico, I was staying with a family, and the family would watch The Simpsons at night. You know, it was just, Hollywood was everywhere. And very influential. They have a gospel message according to Hollywood, and they promote it, and they are good. It is everywhere. We could probably take a few notes from that. But one of the movies that came out a little while back that was very famous, very popular, was the Harry Potter story, the Harry Potter movies, the Harry Potter books. And when it came out, a lot of evangelical Christians were very upset because it was about magic. And magic is contrary to our faith. We know that. And so magic is trying to seize power that only God has, the power to, if you will, control nature, the power to create from nothing. That's like magic, and we do not have that power. And so if somebody claims to have that power, it's like they're claiming to have a power that only God has. They're almost claiming to be more powerful than God. So we say, yes, that's contrary to our faith. But when it came out, I think there was also something that we missed. And so when I was speaking to some evangelicals about this, I shared with them, I said, do you know the story about Harry Potter? Not necessarily defending the magic or anything like that, but I said, do you know the story? And so I walked through the story and I said, I want you to tell me if this is familiar. So the story of Harry Potter begins with a little baby boy, right? And this little baby boy is very, very special. And this little baby boy, in fact, is a chosen one. Now, that should already sound familiar, because how does Luke and Matthew begin, those two Gospels? The little baby boy who is a chosen one. He's the Messiah, right? Now, Harry Potter comes on the scene as this little baby boy, but his story is very much connected to the story of his mother, because his mother dies, his mother is killed defending him from this very, very evil character. And so Mary, the mother of Harry, becomes, if you will, the first martyr. She becomes one as an example of heroic love. So already you have this entire story with a foundation, and the foundation is based upon the love of his mother that protected him from this evil character, but then gave Harry, this little baby, gave him the power to destroy also this evil one. And he is the only one who has the power to do it. Now, that should really sound familiar. It sounds like there is no other religion in the world that stresses the necessity, the foundational element of self-sacrificial love as the Gospels, as Jesus Christ. Now, as the story of Harry continues, he begins to discover later on that the only way he can destroy this evil character, who is totally the embodiment of Satan, right? The only way he can destroy him is by sacrificing himself, and by willingly sacrificing himself. That's the only way he can save the world. Now, that sounds like Jesus Christ. It sounds like his death on the cross. And there is no other story to glean that from. They took that from our faith. So I wonder if the author of Harry Potter has ever given royalties to Jesus, because it is the story of Jesus. Now, I bring this all up to set kind of a tone. In part of the story of Harry Potter, when he's younger, he comes across this mirror, this giant mirror. And so he looks into this mirror, and he obviously sees himself, but this mirror is magical, and this mirror can show the person standing there, in this case Harry, can show him what he desires most. And so Harry begins to sit in front of this mirror, seeing what he desires most. And it's his two parents, because both of his parents were actually martyred. Both of his parents were killed when he was a baby. And so he doesn't really remember them. All he remembers is their love. And so he sits there for hours and hours just seeing in this mirror his parents who love him. And it's beautiful, but then he's reminded by others that he's going to have to live his life. That others have come before him and discovered that mirror, and has sat in front of that mirror and just gazed upon that which they desired most, whatever it was, and eventually went insane. What is it we desire most? And so the thing is, if what we desire most is not that which God desires to give us, we eventually will go insane. And I don't necessarily mean mentally, but how we live our life will become insane. It will become disconnected from that which God desires to give. And so the treasure we desire is not the treasure we're ever going to receive, because the treasure we're supposed to receive is from God. Now, Harry realizes that even though he loves his parents very deeply, they are dead, and he can't bring them back. And so he's going to have to live his life. He's going to have to leave that mirror, and he's going to have to discover what he needs to do in his life. And so we go a little bit deeper with the parable. The soil, the earth, the land, it's our soul. Now God comes and he plants within us the treasure. And for us as Christians, we should see very clearly, especially as Catholics, we should see very, very clearly the beauty of these tangible sacraments that God gives us. From baptism, from our birth, we are chosen, we are anointed, we are given this special grace to have within us, and it can never be taken by anybody. No one has, not even Satan has power over this. We have this indelible treasure that's given to us. And then as we continue on in our life, we have the ability to be reconciled to God, to be nurtured by God in the Eucharist. And then when we desire to give our life, whether as a priest in holy orders or in the married life to have a family, all of that is an expression of God's treasure. It's all God working. Or simply just acting by faith, simply trusting God, which again is contrary to magic, right? Because we need God, we need Him. And so we surrender ourselves to God, and so faith becomes the manifestation of this treasure. We've unburied it, we're using it, we're living it, we're enjoying it. Even to a person, though, who's never been baptized, even to a person who's never known Christ, we call it natural law, that there is this grace, there is this law, if you will, given by God to every single human being, where we just naturally desire eternity. We naturally desire to be with God. And we can seek it in all kinds of earthly ways, but it'll never satisfy. In the readings today, we had a reading about Solomon, King Solomon, and it's a beautiful reading today because God asks him what he desires, and he says, I desire wisdom. And so God, please give me wisdom. And so God's very impressed by that. He's impressed because he doesn't ask for treasure. He doesn't ask for a long life. He doesn't ask for revenge on his enemies. He asks for wisdom. And it's beautiful. But the whole story of King Solomon is one that's maybe not so beautiful, because he eventually becomes corrupted. And so you know the number 666, right? We know it as an evil number, but that number comes from King Solomon. It comes to be a label for him of his greed and of his desire for money. Because as time would go on, yes, he was very wise, he was given that gift, but that wasn't enough for him. And so he constantly began to hoard just tons and tons of stuff, and he basically enslaved his country and his enemies to build all these magnificent places. And he would have hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines, and he became a man who really just saw himself as God. And so he became corrupted. And his desire changed. It was no longer for God or with God or in God. And so our treasure must remain. We must remain faithful to the treasure God desires to give us. The last few weeks we've had some really beautiful and incredible women saints that we've been celebrating. We had Saint Katere Tekakwitha, whom I spoke about a couple weeks ago in one of my homilies. Just a beautiful, beautiful woman, and how she lived her faith and how she had every reason to not, but she was transformed by the treasure. She opened that treasure. She embraced it fully, and nothing was going to take her away from it. And then we had the story of St. Anne, the mother of Mary, and again, just a beautiful example of true humble faith, trusting in God's will, even if it wasn't necessarily perhaps what any mother would have wanted, but she trusted in God's will, and then God had the ability to act in her life. And then we had St. Mary Magdalene, who is the premier saint of transformation, of someone whose life was a complete disaster, complete mess, seeking treasure in every other possible way. But she turned to Jesus and she discovered this treasure, right? So all of these are examples of this parable, but they all point to the same thing, right? This weekend we also had two women saints. So really, we mentioned one of them, but the other is implied. In the Saint Martha. So Saint Martha and her sister Mary, Saint Mary, so Martha and Mary. And Martha and Mary become symbols of the two sides of our faith, and just kind of getting back to this idea of really, really listening. So in your prayer, it's such an important thing to listen. For so much of my life in prayer, I would not listen. I would talk. I would say everything that I wanted, that I needed, that I thought was good for me and my family and everything in the world. But it was me talking, right? And then when I was done, and I would never actually listen. And don't you think it makes perfect sense that God wants us to have the bulk of our prayer as listening? But it requires us surrendering to silence. It requires taking part of our day and surrendering it over to God, and not being in control of that time, and just enjoying that time with Jesus and just listening very deeply. And so Mary is the one who does that. Mary, the sister, she sits at the feet of Jesus, and when Martha is telling her to get up and work, Jesus says no. She needs to listen, right? Maybe sometimes somebody tells us that, or we should tell somebody that. When they're getting really frenzied and really stressed out, that's a great sign to say, you need to listen. You need to go pray. Go in the church, all alone, and you just need to listen. Martha, on the other hand, after the death of their brother Lazarus, she's the one who runs to Jesus. She runs to Jesus, and so she takes this action, right? This action, but she points it at Jesus, and she runs to Jesus out of love for her brother. And Mary, in this moment, is maybe not necessarily the one who's doing the right thing, because she doesn't run to Jesus. She just sits at home and grieves. But eventually Martha beckons her sister to come, to listen to Jesus. And so great examples. Listen to Jesus. And then Jesus in that story does some incredible things. All right, the buried treasure, it's right here, it's close. God's placed it there for you. for you to discover, for you to use, for you to be close to Him. God bless.